We started today in Romans chapter 8. If you'll open your Bibles there. Romans 8. The beginning point of verse 6 and verse 7. Similarities that they have. Romans chapter 8, verse 6. To be carnally minded is death. Verse 7. Carnally minded is enmity against God. Think about those phrases for just a minute. How serious. Whatever it means to be carnal minded, we might need to get a grip on that because those are some serious things that's describing it. Verse 6, to be carnally minded is death. Obviously talking about a spiritual death, not a physical one. And then in verse 7, the carnal mind is enmity against God, hostile against God. Basically, to paraphrase that, the carnal mind is at war against God. So if it's spiritual death and it's the enemy, the enmity, the warfare against God, if it's hostile toward deity, we might need to know exactly what that's talking about. The idea behind carnal minded is it's just when our thinking is totally and completely from the physical perspective. That's what the carnal mind is meaning there. As a matter of fact, the newer translation, instead of saying carnally minded, it says the mind of the flesh. A fleshly thinking mind. Every decision we make, every choice that we make, every thought that we give serious consideration to, it's all from the physical side of it. That's what's being referred to there. And when we get to that point, when all of our thoughts are fleshly, when all of our decisions are totally upon the fleshly consequences and the fleshly joy we get from them, desires will control us. There's no way around it. When every decision we make is simply based on the flesh, then fleshly desires will ultimately control us. And when that happens, there's some logical progressions of how we begin to think. We're going to, first of all, as Christians, we're talking about Christians who can take on this mindset. We'll convince ourselves that we need it. Once we've done that, we'll convince ourselves that we're not going to get caught. And once we've done that, we'll convince ourselves, if our conscience begins to get at us a little bit, we'll then convince ourselves, that I'm a little different. I'm wired differently than others. I have a little bit stronger pulls in this thing than others do. It's harder for me to control my desires than it is for others. And once we convince ourselves of that, well, then God will understand. I know what it says, and I know, but I'm a little different, and my desires are stronger than most other people, and God will understand that. And when we get to that, at some point in all this, we're going to convince ourselves that this craving that we might have, these desires we might have, we're going to convince ourselves they're better than they really are. And we're going to ignore the negative, even to the point of being irrational. And if you want an example of that, just think about Esau. Think about his carnal mind. Think about his decision that was made totally on the flesh. He comes in after a hard day's work, comes in tired, comes in hungry, and he trades his birthright for one meal. How many meals have you had in your life? How many meals did you have yesterday? One meal. And he traded away something that was incredibly valuable. He traded a valuable thing for a momentary craving, a momentary desire. Now, we'll come back to him in just a moment, but there's an example of how irrational we can be. Sitting here right now, we can think to ourselves, well, that is so silly. Why would Esau, I hadn't thought about Esau in a while, but, that was a really bad decision he made. We've made the same thing. We've made decisions totally on a fleshly impulse. We have made decisions totally and completely on an intense craving in the moment. And it might not have been for the bowl of food, but we've done it for something else. We understand exactly what he did. So after having that as an introduction, now let's change our thinking for a moment. Let's go back to the wilderness period. Go back to the Exodus period. Think about that Exodus time period. In a book full of some really incredible, powerful things. There's stuff going on in the Exodus period. That's top shelf stuff. You've got, who is this Lord that you say I should, let's introduce him to you. And there's the 10 plagues. That's who he is. Think about the period of the plagues. And then think about the Passover night. Actually, don't think about the Passover night. Think about the next morning following the Passover. When families all over the nation opened up their eyes and saw a dead son. You think about the firstborn in house after house after house after house. Then think about the Red Sea and the traveling through on dry ground, and in a book full of some impressive feats of power. There's some really special things that never happened again. Special things that happened there. Think about how memorable they are to us, and we're looking back through the window of history, and they're still powerful events. Now imagine we live through it. Take yourself back, and we're one of the slaves in Israel under Egyptian bondage. We're one of the ones out there building the bricks every day. We're one of the ones who was there when the frogs took over the houses, and when the lice took over the flesh, and when the cows started dying, and when the firstborn started dying. We were there for all that. We were there. We're walking on those 2 walls of water as we make our way through on dry ground. We were there. Imagine that. That was unforgettable things, right? And not so fast. Because it wasn't long at all before they forgot it all. And all they're doing is complaining. Remember when we won't turn to Exodus 16. Be turning, by the way, to Numbers 11. We're all going to pick up our study there. Be turning to Numbers 11. But as you're turning there, I guess the place where we have most of our information about the manna is in Exodus chapter 16. But let's remind ourselves of what God did for them every day once they got across into the wilderness area. Manna, just this gift from heaven, bread from heaven. That it preserved the life of roughly 2+ million people for 40 years. Think about that. Half the state of Alabama, if I remember the last census, Alabama's got roughly 4 million citizens in it. They were roughly, the best guess is, it's just a guess, but the best guess seems to be roughly 2 million plus or so. Imagine half the state of Alabama being furnished for 40 years. And imagine how long it would have lasted were God not doing that. Take 2 million people, put them in the middle of a deserted area, and how long does it take before all the fruit's gone? They never stayed anywhere long enough to cultivate ground. And how long before they are starving? And why did they not starve? It's because God providing from heaven manna. It came right to them. They opened up their tent every morning, and it wasn't a frost, it wasn't snow, but they open up their tent, they stick their head out, and they see it. They don't have to walk 5 miles to find it. No, it came to them. Now, I don't want to go too far with that. It still required labor. They couldn't just go out like a baby bird and open up their mouth and it fall into the mouth. They still had to go get it every day. They had to bring it in, and they did their preparing it, and then they cooked it. God doesn't do for us what we can do for ourselves. But he did for them what they could not do for themselves, and that is provide life, provide bread, provide sustenance. And he did it for 40 years. And yet they are discontent with that in no time. They cry out loud about it. They don't just think it, but they're verbalizing it. Out loud, they moan about it. How monotonous that it was. And let's just pause real quick. It'd be wrong not to pause here. To you and I, are we no better? God blessing us every single day. God taking and sustaining every single day. But we look out and we're not happy with it. We look at our window, we see blessings everywhere we look. Look at our bedroom, see blessings everywhere we look. But we're not happy with them. Still complaining, moaning, and how do you explain that? All those wonderful events they saw in Egypt. The daily provisions being provided, and they're not happy. Numbers 11 tells us why they're not happy. Look in verse 4. Numbers 11, verse 4. The mixed multitude that was among them. The old King James says, fell lusting. But the idea is that word we were using earlier, craving. They've got these intense cravings. I have heard, and Carla never went through this, and she went just a couple of weeks ago. She was talking about she was glad. I don't remember what came up, but she said, I sure am glad when I was pregnant I didn't go through all those cravings that some people have. And some of you will experience. You know what that's like. She never really had any strange things, but there's been women during their pregnancy that just wanted to eat things they'd never wanted before, kind of strange things, and all of us to some extent have gone through some cravings. We wake up and got a cabinet full of food and a refrigerator full of food, but it's not going to do unless we have this. There's a certain thing in that moment that we want. We know what it means to crave something. That's what verse 4 is talking about. They have fallen to lusting. They have fallen to desiring. They have fallen to craving. They've got something in their mind. It's a fleshly thing, and they can't let go of it. It's consumed them now. What was it? What is this crave that they have? What is it that they're lusting after? And the children of Israel wept again, moaning. They are crying about it. Who will give us flesh to eat? They have got a craving. They are sick of the manna. They are tired of it. Manna today, manna tomorrow. And It's just somebody would give us some meat. Oh, I know who gave us meat. Pharaoh gave us meat. And now they are looking backward and desiring to go back where they came from. Boy, we had meat in Egypt. And then they make this long list. Look in verse 5. We remember. Now let's just pause for a minute. You know what me and you remember about the Exodus? We remember the plagues. You know what we remember? We remember the death of the firstborn. You know what we remember? We remember deliverance. We remember providence. We remember shows of power that can't be described. They remember the fish, which we ate freely. We remember the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. Oh, when we think, they're thinking back to Egypt and everything is positive. Everything is good. And, if we could just go back to that. We had fish out every time we wanted it. And we had cucumbers. That's what they remember. Which means this is what they have forgotten. Let's just go back and let's just change the way this reads. In verse 5, it says, this is what we remember. Well, let's go back and let's change the word from remember to forget. And see how this verse sounds a little differently. We have forgotten the slavery, which we did in Egypt. We have forgotten the affliction, the burdens, the tears, the groaning, the tyrant, the dead kids. Do you remember how Moses got into the house of Pharaoh to begin with? It's because out of fear of how big the number of Israelites had gotten, they started killing children. They started killing the babies to control population numbers. They don't remember that. So let's just pause and let me ask you some questions. I'm sure there's people in this room who like cucumbers. Cucumbers going to make you forget you lost a child? Is the best onion that you have ever eaten in your life going to make you forget that they killed your kids? Is the best fish that the shrimp basket has to offer down the road, does the best fish dinner you've ever had make you forget they killed your son? Because that's what they have forgotten. That is how irrational fleshly minds can get us. That's why Esau trades a valuable thing for a 5-minute meal. That's why 2 million plus or so can forget about slavery and bondage and tears and pain and mistreatments and funerals. And all they think about is how good one meal would taste. That's what intense cravings can do. When they get control of us, they get control of us. And when they get control of us, we're going to forget everything else but the craving, the lusting, the desiring, and nothing will fit until we get it scratched, until we get what we want. So no, we are not unique. And God's given us these examples to show us how ridiculous that the fleshly mind is. That's why it leads to death, Romans 8. That's why it is hostile and enmity against God. And today, in this quiet setting, when shown these examples of Esau and the Israelites, hopefully we can realize, yeah, that really is ridiculous. Turn to Jude, and let's just look at what God thinks about this. Well, the cravings, they cause us, all we'll do is we'll forget those negatives. And we'll devalue what God has done for us. And the example of Israel is, if looking back and things really weren't all that bad in Egypt, well, that by extension means what God did really wasn't all that valuable. If it really wasn't that bad, then what he did to get us out of it, it really wasn't all that good. And if we look back and we begin, I know it says not to do it, but that's not as bad a sin as some. It's only affected me, and nobody knows. And so we start kind of ranking sins, and we start kind of overlooking certain sins. And if that sin is not really all that bad, then what Jesus did to cleanse it, it really wasn't all that good. We would never say that. But one has to equal the other. What does God say about all this? How does he view the carnal mind? Look in verse 15. Let's just start here. Jude 15. I'm picking up in the middle of the context and talking about executing judgment. But look at that next phrase, and we can start the point for this particular thought. He wants us to be convicted. He wants to convince all that are ungodly. Among them, all their ungodly deeds, which they have ungodly committed, and all their hard speeches, which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Do you think he's emphasizing something? Ungodly, ungodly, ungodly. I want the ungodly to be convinced of something. I want the ungodly to be convicted about something. And it's about those acts they've committed, the ungodly acts, and the ungodly words and speeches that they have spoken against me. He's emphasizing something. Something is ungodly, and he's not taking it too kindly. And then to make sure that there's no misunderstanding, he begins to make a list of some ungodly things. These are murmurers, Where does that rank on our sins? When we start putting the hierarchy of murders and rape, and where's murmuring at? Because it's the first one on God's list in this particular section when ungodly was being emphasized. Murmurers. Complainers. Does that take us back to Israel? Oh, that fish was the best fish I've ever had. Those cucumbers, those watermelons, let's go back. Complain about what God was doing for them every day. What do we rank that on our list of sins? Walking after their own lust. And there's our cravings. There's our fleshly mind that got this whole thing started. The carnal mind. Murmurers, complainers, walking after their own lust. Their mouth speaking great swelling words, having men's persons in admiration because of advantage. But beloved, remember the words which are spoken before the apostles of our Lord Jesus Christ, how they that told you there would be mockers in the last time who would walk after their own ungodly lust. This was all prophesied and predicted. Verse 19. These be they who separate themselves sensually, having not the Spirit. If we are walking to a fleshly mind, then we are not walking to a spiritual mind. If we are being controlled by fleshly cravings, then we are not being controlled by spiritual desires. That's what verse 19 is saying. There is no spirit within us. It's all flesh. When the mind is flesh, when the mind is carnal, the things we do are going to be carnal. That's what God thinks about it. Turn back a few pages to 2 Peter 1. 2 Peter 1. Here's what God thinks about it. Here's how he describes it in a way we would all understand. 2 Peter 1, verse 9. Now this is following the list of what we call those Christian graces. Add to your faith virtue, and to your virtue knowledge, and knowledge temperance. But in verse 8, it says, now, if these things be in you and abound, if we do what he said, if we add those things, if these things be in you and abound, they make you that you will never be barren or unfruitful in knowledge of the Lord. That's what we get if they're in, if we add them. What about verse 9? But he that lacks these things, the ones that never get around to adding them, that never becomes part of our life, they don't become our character. He that lacks these things is blind and cannot see afar off. Just pause for a minute. What would that be in the medical phrase, in the medical realm? He's describing nearsighted. I can see this. I can't see that. We can all make applications of that in the spiritual. When we are carnally minded and when the flesh is controlling our decisions and all of our lust and desires and cravings are being scratched, it's all about the now. We're not fulfilling those with eyes on heaven. We're nearsighted, verse 9. We are blind, we can't see afar off, and have forgotten that we were purged from our sins. Remember, in Egypt, if looking back, and Egypt really wasn't all that bad, then what God did to get them out really wasn't all that great. And if we look back longingly with sin, oh, I sure do wish I could do that again. If sin really wasn't all that bad, then what Jesus did to correct it really wasn't all that great. We have forgotten we were purged of sin. We were forgotten somebody died for that. How do you correct forgetting something? Look in verse 12. Therefore, I will not be negligent to put you always in remembrance of these things, that you know them. Verse 13. Yes, I think it is fitting, it is proper. As long as I am in this tabernacle, as long as I'm living, he's talking, that tabernacle there is referring to his body. As long as I'm in this body, it's fitting to stir you up by putting you in remembrance. Verse 15. Moreover, I endeavor that you might be able after my decease, once I'm dead, to have these things always in remembrance. If we're walking by the flesh, we are short-sighted. We are nearsighted. We can't see afar off. We have forgotten some things. And so Peter says, it's my duty to remind you. I have reminded you of things. And then he says, as long as I'm still living, I'm going to keep on reminding you of these things. And then through these letters that I'm writing you, even after I'm dead, I can remind you of things. Peter got his wish, because here 2,000 years later, roughly, he's reminding us of some things. We need reminders, and that's what this is. Because too often we've been like Esau. Too often we've been like the Israelites, and we have forgotten, and we're not content, and the cravings take over. So now let's pause one last time, and let's change gears again. Cravings are cravings, and desires are desires. And usually we always think of them in the sinful way, in the fleshly way. Craving food, craving sex, craving stuff, craving possessions, desiring physical stuff. Is it possible that those intense cravings, those intense desires, is it possible that we can redirect them to spiritual things? Look at the 84th Psalm. Can we direct our cravings toward a proper avenue? Take those intense feelings and put them to work for good. The psalmists tell us that we can. We'll look at several of them. We won't make any applications about them. I'm not going to add to it. Just let the words mean what they mean. 84th Psalm. Look in verse 1. How amiable are your tabernacles, O Lord, Lord of hosts. Oh, what wonderful dwelling places you're in. My soul longs, verse 2, even faints for the courts of the Lord. How wonderful it is where you dwell, and I long to be there. That's what verse 2 is saying. I faint. Which, I mean, we talk about, I'm tired of it. I am so consumed with this. It's like I'm about to faint. I'm longing. I'm desiring to dwell with you. The idea is just never filled with, never satiated. Have you ever gone to of course you have. Go to a restaurant and the waitress bringing down sweet tea. 5 minutes later, sweet tea. At some point, you're going to probably, that's enough. Could you imagine at that point the waitress starts arguing with you? You know, we don't charge for refills. You know, let me give you a little bit more. You're not going to have to pay anything extra. Your bill's not going up. And no, thank you. I've had enough. It doesn't matter that it's free. It doesn't matter that we're not going to have to pay. We've had enough. We're filled. What verse 2 is saying is, I'm never filled with desiring to be with you. I never get to the point where I have had enough. I continue to long for more. Turn back to the 42nd Psalm. Here's one you'll probably be more familiar with. Instead of reading the 42nd Psalm, the truth is we could sing it. We know the tune it's been set to. 42nd Psalm, verse 1. As the deer pants for the brooks of water, my soul pants for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When will I come and appear before him? Instead of, think more of a dog. We might be a little bit more familiar with that than most of us are with deers, but of course it would apply to any animal. But most of us, whether we've ever had a dog as a pet, we know we've been around dogs enough. And we have seen dogs when they are panting. They're out chasing, they're playing fetch, and they're chasing sticks, and they're chasing balls, and then they come back. And after 5-10 minutes or so, their tongue is hanging to the ground. And they are panting, fighting for breath, and the tongue is just hanging down, and you get them water. And the psalmist says, that's how my heart is. Panting, wanting more, can't get it quick enough, desiring it. And then in verse 2, it says, when's it? It's all I'm thinking about. It's all I long for. It's all I desire for. When's it going to happen? When do I get to be with you? And so the point is, we think of lust and desires and cravings always in the negative. But if we are panting and craving and desiring spiritual things, how does that change our life? How does that get us away from the carnal mind to the spiritual mind? Let me give you one more example. Look in 1 Corinthians 16. And by the way, there are other Psalms where that idea of panting and longing and desiring spiritual blessings are. I want to look at a New Testament example. The newer translations have changed this, but the idea is still the same. I mean, the root definition is still the same. 1 Corinthians 16. I think it's only the Old King James that uses this word, so most of yours will not have it, but it's interesting that it was ever used in that way. In 1 Corinthians 16, the long list of, salutations and Greek so-and-sos. 1 Corinthians 16:15. I beseech you, brethren, you know the house of Stephanas, that it the first fruits of Achaia, and that they have set themselves, devoted themselves to the ministry of the saints. But you know what the Old King James says there? It doesn't say they've set themselves. It doesn't say they devoted themselves. It says they've addicted themselves. So again, I'll ask the question, when we hear the word addiction, oh, that's bad. The house of Stephanas addicted themselves to serving people, to ministering to saints. Now, again, the newer translations have got the word devoted. Well, what does devoted mean? It means you are focused on something. Devoted means that you are doing something and doing it habitually. When it says they have set themselves on it, it means it's not something they take or leave. The word addicted works there. There's nothing at all improper about using that word. They addicted themselves. They set themselves. They devoted themselves to service. And so again, I'm asking the question, can we take those? All of us have desires. All of us have cravings. They don't have to be bad. The question is, what is it that we crave after? What is it that we desire after? All of us have some addictions. They don't have to be bad. What is it we're addicted to? What is it that we're devoted to, that we set our mind to? To use the word from the Old King James, here's a spiritual addiction, a spiritual craving, a craving rooted in faith and in hope and in love. So, can we work on becoming addicted to serving? Can we work on becoming addicted to praying? Can we work on becoming addicted to assembling? Can we work on becoming addicted to deeper study, more serious study? Can we see the value in the things of God over any physical craving that is temporary and might be quick happening, might be a quick hit, but it decays and there's no long-term, we're getting away from the short-sightedness and the nearsighted. There's no long-term benefit to that. Get your psalm books out. Remember, to talk back about Esau just a moment. After Esau had fulfilled the craving, after Esau had scratched the itch, well, at another time when he had some time to think about it, he cried about that. The Hebrew writer talks about the tears of Esau. But there was nothing that could be changed. It was done. There was a fleeting, momentary craving and a carnal, fleshly mind that scratched it, and there was no going back. So there are things you and I can do that there's consequences to, and some of those consequences are eternal. So let's be careful. But now, the beauty of of the invitation of God is that there's no sin that you and I can't cover today. So take advantage of it. Let's not forget how horrible sin is. Or like the Israelites, let's not forget how horrible bondage was. Let's not forget how horrible the taskmaster is. And let's appreciate, and let's be thankful, and let's not complain, and let's serve Him habitually, addictively. And let that become our craving. And like the deer panting for the water, let us pant for Him and for His presence. If there's anything we can do to help you to be ready for that, do it while we stand.